What happens when one man decides to reshape an entire continent by force? A lot of war. From 1803 to 1815, Europe was consumed by the Napoleonic Wars, a series of conflicts that saw Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire battle against almost every major power on the continent. At his peak, Napoleon ruled over most of Europe, defeating kings and emperors with his brilliant military tactics. But his ambition would ultimately lead to disaster, exile, and final defeat. These wars redrew the map of Europe, revolutionized warfare, and changed history forever. But how did it all begin? To understand that, we need to look at the chaos that came before Napoleon's rise. The Napoleonic Wars didn't start in a vacuum. They were the direct result of the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, a period of extreme political upheaval, war, and the complete destruction of France's monarchy. In the late 18th century, France was on the brink of collapse. Decades of economic mismanagement, war debts, and a rigid social hierarchy led to widespread discontent. The people rose up, storming the Bastille in 1789 and setting off a revolution that would end centuries of absolute monarchy. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were executed, and in their place, a new republic was born. But revolution brought chaos. France was now at war with almost every major European power, as monarchies across the continent feared that revolutionary ideals would spread to their own lands. The wars were brutal, and at times, France seemed doomed. Political instability reached its peak during the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794, when thousands, including revolutionaries themselves, were executed under suspicion of being enemies of the Republic. It was this period of constant warfare and political turmoil that a young Corsican officer named Napoleon Bonaparte began to making a name for himself. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, Napoleon was an outsider in French politics, but what he lacked in noble connections, he made up for with military brilliance and ambition. He rose through the ranks during the French Revolutionary Wars, proving himself in Italy and Egypt, where his tactical genius and bold strategies won him the admiration of both soldiers and politicians. By 1799, France was still at war, the government was unstable, and the people were desperate for strong leadership. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon staged a coup, overthrowing the ineffective Directory and declaring himself First Consul, essentially making him the leader of France. But one title wasn't enough. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, signalling to the world that he wasn't just another ruler. He was building an empire. Europe wasn't going to sit back and let France become a dominant superpower. Almost immediately, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed coalitions against Napoleon, trying to contain his ambitions. But they underestimated him. Napoleon redesigned warfare, introducing lightning-fast movements, decisive battles, and flexible strategies that overwhelmed his enemies. His armies, fueled by French nationalism and revolutionary zeal, crushed opposition on the battlefield. With France now a military powerhouse, Napoleon set his sights on reshaping Europe itself. The old monarchies were still standing, but for how long? The stage was set for one of the most intensive and transformative conflicts in history. The Napoleonic Wars had begun. By 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just the ruler of France. He was the most feared man in Europe. The monarchs of Britain, Austria, Russia and Prussia saw him as a dangerous upstart, a revolutionary general who had torn apart the old order and was now building an empire of his own. They had tried to defeat him before, but each time he emerged stronger than ever. Now, war was inevitable again. The Napoleonic Wars had begun. Napoleon's first major challenge came when Britain, Austria and Russia formed the Third Coalition to stop him. Napoleon, however, was unshaken. He famously declared, "You must not fight too often with one enemy, or you will teach him all your art of war." And Napoleon had plenty of art left to teach. In 1805, he marched his army across Europe at lightning speed, launching one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. While Britain dominated at sea, winning a decisive victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon ruled the land. He crushed Austria and Russia at the legendary Battle of Austerlitz, a battle so perfect in execution that it is still studied by military strategists today. "Soldiers, I am pleased with you. On the battles of Austerlitz, you have surpassed my expectations," Napoleon told his men after the battle. The victory at Austerlitz forced Austria into submission and led to the collapse of the Third Coalition. Napoleon was now unstoppable. But Napoleon's enemies weren't finished yet. By 1806, Prussia, fearing French expansion, joined a new alliance with Britain and Russia, the Fourth Coalition. Napoleon wasted no time. At the Battle of Jena-Austedt, 1806, the French utterly destroyed Prussia's military might. The once proud Prussian army, known as one of the strongest in Europe, was shattered in a matter of days. Napoleon personally marched into Berlin, declaring, "The world will be astonished at what I have accomplished with so small a force." Prussia, humiliated and broken, surrendered. The only major power left to fight Napoleon was Russia. In 1807, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander I on the battlefield at Friedland, delivering yet another crushing defeat. Rather than continue the war, the Tsar agreed to negotiate. At the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft in the middle of a river, dividing Europe between them. Napoleon was at the height of his power. But controlling land wasn't enough. Napoleon wanted to defeat Britain, the one enemy he could never face directly in battle. So, in 1806, he issued the Continental System, a decree banning trade with Britain across all of Europe. His goal was simple: starve the British economy and force them to surrender. But Britain was resilient. Instead of collapsing, it used its navy to blockade Europe, hurting French allies more than Britain itself. The policy backfired, creating resentment across the continent, a problem that would come back to haunt Napoleon. By 1810, Napoleon ruled most of Europe. He had replaced monarchs with his own family members. His brother Joseph as King of Spain, his brother Louis as King of Holland, and his allies as rulers of newly created French satellite states. But even at the height of his power, he knew that his position was fragile. "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a step," he once said. And that step would soon come. Arrogance, overreach, and rebellion would begin to crack the foundation of Napoleon's empire. The wars were far from over. Spain was about to revolt. Russia was about to burn. And Napoleon was about to face the greatest disaster of his career. By 1808, Napoleon was at the height of his power. He had defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and his empire stretched across most of Europe. Yet, his downfall had already begun, not in a grand battle against a great empire, but in a slow, grinding war in Spain and a disastrous march into Russia. Napoleon, once the master of speed and strategy, would now find himself trapped in wars of attrition that he could not win. Napoleon once said, "I would rather face 50,000 men in battle than 100 newspaper editors." But he underestimated something even worse: a determined population willing to resist at any cost. When Napoleon forced the Spanish king to abdicate in 1808 and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne, he expected Spain to submit. Instead, the country erupted into rebellion. What followed was a brutal, drawn-out conflict known as the Peninsular War. Unlike the decisive battles Napoleon was used to, this war was a slow, grinding disaster. The Spanish and Portuguese, with the support of Britain's Duke of Wellington, waged guerrilla warfare, striking Napoleon's supply lines, ambushing his troops, and slowly bleeding the French army dry. For the first time, Napoleon was losing, not in a traditional battle, but in a war of resistance. He threw more men into Spain, but the more he sent, the more he lost. The Peninsular War became a gaping wound in his empire, draining resources and morale. Still, Napoleon pressed on. He believed in his invincibility, and that belief would lead him to his greatest mistake. In 1812, Napoleon made the fatal decision to invade Russia. Tsar Alexander I had broken their alliance and refused to enforce the continental system, allowing trade with Britain. Napoleon, seeing it as a betrayal, gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, and marched towards Moscow. It should have been a quick campaign. Instead, it became a nightmare. The Russians refused to fight a traditional battle. Instead, they retreated deeper into their country, burning everything behind them, a strategy known as scorched earth. Napoleon's army, relying on local resources, found nothing but empty fields and destroyed villages. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he expected the Russians to surrender. Instead, the city was set on fire, leaving him no shelter, no food, and no way forward. Then came the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted, supplies ran out, and the once mighty Grande Armée began to disintegrate. Soldiers froze to death, starved, or were picked off by Russian attacks. By the time Napoleon ordered the retreat, it was too late. His army, once 600,000 strong, was reduced to fewer than 100,000 survivors. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered. The Russian disaster inspired the rest of Europe to rise against it. And soon, the war would come to him. After the disastrous retreat from Russia in 1812, Napoleon's empire was on the brink of collapse. The once mighty Grande Armée had been decimated, and for the first time, Europe saw Napoleon as vulnerable. Sensing the moment, Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia formed a new alliance, the Sixth Coalition, to finally bring him down. Napoleon, refusing to surrender, rallied his remaining forces. But, as he once admitted, the battlefield is a scene of constant chaos. The winner will be the one who controls that chaos, both his own and the enemy's. And now, for the first time, Napoleon had lost control. With Europe united against him, Napoleon was forced into a desperate defensive war. His enemies had learned from past defeat. Instead of facing him in small, isolated battles, they now coordinated their attacks, overwhelming his forces on multiple fronts. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Leipzig, 1813, also known as the Battle of Nations. Facing a coalition army of over 350,000 troops, Napoleon's forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. After 3 brutal days of fighting, the French were defeated, and Napoleon was forced to retreat back to France. Still, he refused to give up, and Napoleon kept fighting, launching one last series of defensive battles in France in early 1814. But it wasn't enough. The coalition armies pushed into Paris, and in April 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The once great emperor was exiled to the small island of Elba off the coast of Italy. His empire was over. Or so everyone thought. But Napoleon wasn't done yet. In 1815, less than a year after his exile, he escaped from Elba, landed in France, and marched towards Paris. The king's army was sent to stop him, but when they met Napoleon on the road, he walked towards them and declared, "If any of you will shoot your emperor, here I am." No one fired. Instead, they cheered him. Napoleon retook the throne without a single battle, and within weeks, he was back in power. Europe, however, wasn't about to let him rule again. The Seventh Coalition, led by Britain and Prussia, gathered their forces for a final confrontation. On June the 18th, 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington and his Prussian army. Despite his tactical brilliance, Napoleon was outmatched and outnumbered. His final attack failed, and his army collapsed. Napoleon had lost, for good. After Waterloo, Napoleon was captured and exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There would be no escape. He spent his final years writing memoirs, reflecting on his past victories and mistakes. Before his death in 1821, he reportedly said, "I died before my time, killed by the English oligarchy and its hired assassins." Whether true or not, Napoleon's story was far from over. Even in death, he remained one of the most studied and debated figures in history. His wars shaped the modern world, his strategies are still taught in military academies, and his legacy lives on. But in the end, his greatest enemy wasn't Britain, Russia, or Austria. It was time itself. The Napoleonic Wars reshaped Europe, redrawing borders, toppling monarchies, and introducing military strategies still studied today. Napoleon's ambition led him to unimaginable heights, but also to his downfall. He was a brilliant tactician, a revolutionary leader, and a man whose name still commands respect and debate. His empire collapsed, but his influence never faded. Modern law, warfare, and nationalism all bear his mark. Was Napoleon a military genius or a reckless conqueror? Would Europe have been better off without him, or did he push history forward? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.